All right, there we go. Mm, I didn't want to do that. Okay, here we go. So we've talked about schemas. We did an activity on it. I just want to remind everybody of one of the popular theories is Jean Piaget. He's the one that came up and termed the word schema and where everything is built upon. And I just want to kind of emphasize this stage of development, okay, and what he's kind of stated about it. Okay, remember, so infancy 0 to 2 is a sensory motor. In this stage, infants understand the world as taken in through their senses. And that's the kind of the important component that Piaget really left us with, is that uh, infants are gaining their senses. And we know that when, for example, if an infant isn't allowed to see or anything like that, they have trouble developing vision. Infants who were not exposed to sounds tend to not be able to hear sounds, and we kind of talked about that a few times, okay? And we see that in the sensory motor stage, there tends to be 4 general trends in the development. One is the reflex and the goal-directed activities. So we talked about in the physical development component, we talked about the different reflexes that infants have, and then those develop into more complex behaviors. All right. The second one is it's from the body to the outside world. The goal of infancy is to gain control over one's body, and then to master the environment. And the third one, the development of object permanence. This is one of debate. So again, the idea of object permanence is the ability to retain things in your mind, even though they're not in your immediate sensory environment. Okay. And I should say that this is probably one of the more controversial parts of Piaget's theory, because with modern technologies, we can show object permanence as young as 4 months of age. So that is one of the things that is of debate about Piaget's theory about when infants are actually able to hold information in their minds. From motor action to mental representation, and that's what this is all about in from a sensory motor perspective. Okay. So again, this kind of just goes through the development of sensory motor ability. So using reflexes, these are automatic. Infants make sucking motions, mouth, then stroking on the cheek, and then we get into primary circular reactions. Infants adjust sucking to accommodate, for example, a pacifier, okay? So they adapt those reflexes to their given environment, okay? And then secondary circular reaction is repetition of action that makes interesting events last. So infants swing their arm and happens to hit a bell, they repeat the action many times, okay? Coordination of reaction and application to new situations. This is action schemas, how to particularly behave within a given scenario. So an infant taps a bell, tries tapping a new object to see if it reacts the same way. So it's creating schemas for the objects that it's coming across. And then tertiary circular reactions. This is intentional discovery of new means to explore. So if you have 12 to 18, they're becoming more mobile. Toddlers ring bells and discover hitting bells with sticks also makes it ringing. So different ways to interact with information. And then invention of means of exploration through mental, so using mental activity to guide exploration. And this is, in this last phase, this is why it's recommended that you start reading to children at the earliest age possible, because the goal is to get them to do activities in a mental way and exist within their mental world, because that's going to evolve their learning and cognitive abilities as they get older and older and older. So I want to talk about, so we talked about schemas, okay? And now what I want to talk about is what's called theory of core knowledge. If you've watched the show Inside Out, it's a Disney Pixar show where there's, different passions that live up in your brain, and happiness, I think happiness, sadness, anger. I forget the other one, but through life, they mention these core memories that develop. Okay, those core memories are an accumulation of all the schemas and knowledge that little infant into childhood has been developing. And it's these core knowledge or this core information that is going to develop the child into the type of individual that they are. And a lot of personality factors and ways of interacting with people come from this core knowledge base. Okay, so the theory is basic around knowledge, are innate and built into the human brain, that we're programmed to develop core memories. We're programmed to develop language. It's not something, we don't have to learn to develop knowledge. An example of this is infants will look longer at events that are violations of expectations. So they see, and think about this in adult terms. Someone is crying at a comedy club. We're more likely to pay attention to that person and get curious about that person much longer. And this is the same thing with infants, is anytime they see a violation of an expectation, they'll think about it or reflect upon it longer. Okay. And according to Spells and Kinsler, they found that infants basically have 4 types of innate knowledge that then knowledge is built from. Okay, they have knowledge that an object moves as a cohesive unit. It does not contact another object unless they are close to each other, and it moves on a continuous path. Okay, this is something we're born with, according to these individuals. Knowledge that agents, people, act in purposeful ways towards a goal of some type, such as feeding, changing, sleeping, interacting, and knowledge within limits of numbers. We'll get to this in a minute. It's really interesting, some of the research that has come out in about the last 13 years is we're finding that infants as young as 4 to 6 months of age are little statisticians. They're better at predicting the probability of something happening better than adults, and in some cases better than people who their life is statistics, such statisticians. So we'll look at this knowledge of numbers here in a little while, and knowledge of spatial relationships, that we exist in a time and space, and there's some things you can get to and some things you can't. And this is a example of things that infants understand. Okay, they understand that a possible event, if we have this box on top of this box, that you could push it to the other end. Okay, but an impossible event would be to push it all the way almost off of this other box, but it still stays stationary where it is. Okay, and Even babies are surprised when they see objects seemingly defy things like gravity. And as in this frame above, this is that we show things like this to infants, we get it so that will stay like that, and they will pay interest to that much longer than they would, for example, the possible event. They look at that possible event and go, okay, okay, cool. But they'll look at the impossible event trying to figure out how that is possible. When we talked about learning, okay, learning is different than knowledge. Learning is different than knowledge. Knowledge is the things such as memories. It's what we're doing in this class. Learning is changes in behavior, so increases in behaviors or decreases in behaviors. And we have found that infants learn behaviors through three basic processes. One is classical conditioning. This is a form of associative learning where you learn to associate two stimuli together. Probably the most classical example is getting a shot at the doctor's office, so you become fearful of a doctor's office, or the sound of a dental drill, and those kind of give some anxiety because of that association with that setting with what happened. Okay. Operant conditioning, as you can guess, requires the person to operate on it. And operant conditioning works on reward and punishment. So the behaviors that get most rewarded, we tend to do more. Those behaviors that get punished tend to get less. For infants, what we have found is punishment is basically social isolation. So when an infant does something and the parent or person is dissatisfied and no longer provide the infant with attention, that pretty much is going to eliminate that behavior in the future. Unfortunately, this has led to some very poor parenting advice, such as crying it out to get an infant to put an infant on a schedule of sleep. Okay, that's just poor advice. And we'll get, I think we already talked about the negative consequences of that in the physical development section. Okay. The other way is imitation. Okay. Imitation in looking at someone and imitating their emotional expressions. Learning how to drink a bottle is a form of imitation. And so that we find that these are the three primary ways infants learn behaviorally. Okay. And remember, when we're looking at this, these are specific to behaviors, whereas knowledge is specific to, as I said, what we're learning in this class. So what about attention and memory? Okay. So we know in infancy, infants have both selective attention and they have sustained attention, and they can work in tandem with each other. So we know that very early on, an infant develops a preference for mom's voice, for mom's facial features, for mom's smell. And recent evidence even suggests that infants have knowledge of even tones of colors of skin of mom, and they'll actually compare that to people around the infant and determine whether they feel that person is safe or not. Okay. Now, the one thing that infants do lack is what's called control attention. Okay. Sustained attention is the kind of the best example of that is if you've ever spaced out on something, or you get really involved in something and you continue to just have sustained attention. Maybe it's a really good movie. Okay. Controlled attention is when you're in a class and the lecture and the instructor are completely boring, but you need to have some control in order to get the information for a test or for your future career or something. That's controlled attention. And we find that infants do kind of lack that control attention. We also know that they're attracted to novelty and respond less with habituation. Habituation being repeated exposure to something, the infant slowly becomes less and less interested in that given object. The exception is mom and dads and primary caregivers, including grandparents and siblings. Those individuals, infants tend not to habituate, and they react when those individuals come into the room, okay, on the most part. Memories in infancy, 3 months old, remember up to about 1 week, 18 months, about 13 weeks. And then there's something called infantile amnesia that we've talked about that maybe has something to do with the ability to experience pain when we talked in the physical the physical development section. And I'm going to come back to this magic shrinking machine when we get to socio-emotional development. So this does need a little bit updating. So what about categorizations, numbers, and executive functioning? So categorization, we can see at about 4 months of age, can put things into simple categories. Development of the numbers of concepts. So this is not actually a correct statement. Under understanding the numbers at least to 3, we actually know now, because of recent research, that infants actually can have the concept of infinity. As I mentioned earlier, they're actually better statisticians than us adults are. Maybe if we have some time, the research is kind of complicated, but maybe if we have some time, I'll post some of the reasons we know these things on the Canvas page for your own reading. Executive function, inhibition develops during the first 2 years. So inhibition is the ability not to be willing to explore your world in an unhabituated way. And the prefrontal cortex, and this is part of executive functioning, is far from fully developed. Okay. Remember when we were talking about the brain, that's the last area of the brain to fully develop, and we think it's full development. I've heard a lot of age ranges on this, but anywhere from about 18 to 22. Some individuals are actually suggesting that the age is 27, but I think there needs to be more studies done in that area to kind of see when the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, fully develops. And just as a reminder, the prefrontal cortex deals with complex thinking, such as engineering or physics or stuff like that. It also is our problem solving area of the brain. When we're faced with a problem, that's the area we use. It also coordinates our social interactions with other people. And so it's kind of a developing area of the brain that has some complexity to it. And that's why, again, when we look at education and interacting with young children, we want to promote this growth. So encouraging kids at a developmentally appropriate way to explore their world, to engage in it to their fullest, because that will promote that development of the brain up into adolescence. So I know language probably seems really simple to us as adults, but I kind of want to bring up the complexity of words and language, and to me this just is incredible that us as human beings are naturally have this propensity to develop this complexity, and then eventually we don't even think about it anymore. We don't think about these things. So there's kind of four aspects to language. Phonology, and that's the study of sounds and how sounds are put together. Syntax is grammar, so knowing the difference between play and then played. One is present tense, one is past tense. And even the word play, if you think about it, do you want to play tomorrow has a different meaning than do you want to play right now? Same word, different meanings. It's just the context that has to be put in, okay? Semantics, the meanings of words, even though they're phonologically the same. So nice jeans versus nice jeans. It is another thing that an infant needs to have experience with. And then the pragmatics, the way we use language in social contexts, such as, hey, buddy, to a friend versus good morning, professor, to a professor, or in our case, good evening. We use different words for different people, even though this meaning of those words may be the same, okay? And again, I just want to emphasize the complexity of this. So not only do we have to have a word, we have to have a meaning for that word and when to use it in a social context. And we have to understand past, present, or future. What is the place for this? And we have to understand the sounds, okay? So there are some different theories about language development, okay? Probably our first theory was behaviorism. And the two people who kind of wrote about it a lot was by imitation. So Bandura believed that children develop language because they continually imitate the people around them, and that imitation then produces that behavior. And then there was B.F. Skinner, who said that words are reinforced. So those four elements are reinforced in some way to develop words, okay? And B.F. Skinner actually wrote a paper on this. It was about 10 pages long, arguing that language is something that is learned, that it's nurture. If we go back to the nurture nature argument, that it is, we're born with a blank slate and it's learned through the process of reward and punishment. The person at the time who was one of the reviewers of B.F. Skinner's paper was an interesting person named Noam Chomsky. If anyone doesn't know Noam Chomsky, he's a outspoken person about politics and world happenings. He's actually a faculty member for the University of Arizona. But what Chomsky did is he looked at B.F. Skinner's paper, and he was only in his master's program. So basically what happened is his advisor, who was always overseeing him, said, hey, read this paper and write a review. And usually the reviews for these kind of papers are like 1-2 pages. And Chomsky actually wrote over 30 pages as a and it became a rebuttal to this idea that language is something that is learned through imitation and reinforcement. And this became known as the nativist approach. The nativist approach argued that we are pre-wired to learn language at a quick rate. And his arguments for this is what's known as universal grammar. So even though we have practically thousands of languages, okay, in those languages, we have words and meanings that cross boundaries. The best example is mother and father. In every language you'll find the concept of mother and father. You'll find the concept of a home. You'll find a concept of family. And so we're pre-wired to basically learn what the words are in our given situation, in our given culture. He's basically arguing that it's an interaction between our nature and our nurture, okay? And then he came up with the concept of regularization, where when we use more common words, they develop quicker within the mind, okay? And his basic rebuttal, and I can simplify why he what he wrote about behaviorism is, I know I keep bringing this up practically in every class, but kids between the age of 0 to 6 learns, well, I can't even remember the numbers, around 50,000 words, okay? Now, I don't know about you guys, and I don't even know if I actually knew that many words, but I don't know if every time I said a word, my mom rewarded me for that, or the person next to me said, oh, here's a piece of candy, or good job. So I didn't learn, if we read this sentence, brain is constantly processing language even during infancy. I wasn't reinforced for the word brain is, and then constantly processing language even during, I wasn't. And so basically his main argument about behaviorism is that it would literally take a lifetime to learn the language we have if it was based on reinforcement and imitation alone. And so he argued for this nativist idea that we're pre-wired, okay? And then this leads into the other two, the interactionism, readiness to learn interacts with a child's experience. So you're genetically ready to learn language, and then it's that interaction with your environment that develops it. And then cognitive processing theory is the idea that the brain is constantly processing language, even during infancy. If you think about it, whenever you're awake, you're using language. Even if you're not talking to someone, you're having an internal dialogue. You're having an internal dialogue with yourself. And we can even see through brain imaging that when you're asleep, the language areas of the brain, especially when you're in REM sleep, which is associated with dream states, your language areas of the brain are continually going, okay? And so the combination of these things, and I do have to say in behaviorism, imitation and reinforcement does play a role. It's not the complete explanation, but it's a combination of all of these factors that make it so we develop language very rapidly. I just want to read something Mandy put in the chat. My son was in NICU, and we were encouraged to read to them as they laid in the incubator. He's 4 now and knows so many words. I'm 50-50 if me reading to him is contributing to that. And, again, like as Mandy is expressing in the NICU, why they encourage reading and everything is not only for the language development, and I would argue that it contributed to your son's success, but it's also so it keeps the brain active and processing information, because we know that children in NICUs, their brains are meant to be being stimulated by the environment. It's meant to be in an interactive environment, but in the NICU, they're isolated into one environmental contingency. So again, it has a dual purpose. It has that language component, but it also has making sure that the infant is being properly stimulated. Okay. And Stacy put, reading from a young age is so important. I did it because I love reading myself, but I was recommended to do so. My little is 4 as well. Okay. Yes, and it is important. So that's very cool. All right. So just speaking of the physical aspects, language, and the brain, there is very specific areas in the human brain that are dedicated to language development. Okay, the first one is the Broca's area. Okay. Whoops. And the Broca's area involves speech production, it's located right near. So this is the motor cortex. Broca area sits right here, and the regions that control lip action or facial muscles lays right by it. So it's basically communicating with that strip, saying, send this message to the mouth to make these kind of movements. Damage to this area produces problems in producing speech and the tendency to use only very essential words in expression. Okay. The second area is Wernicke's area. We can show this right here. So we see Wernicke is right here. Notice that it's closely associated with the temporal lobe, the visual cortex, and the auditory center where we're processing speech itself. Okay. This area is specifically in understanding and creating meaning in speech. Okay. These individuals don't have any trouble producing words because that's in the Broca's area, but they have trouble making sense of it, or they instead of saying, but no trouble producing actual words, they might say something like actual but no words trouble. See, the motor part of it was okay, but the ability to make that statement make sense is very difficult for people with damage to this area. Okay. Whoops. So let's just kind of go through the stages of language development. The first one is the fetus can hear many things in utero. Okay. Infants prefer sounds of their mother reading, for example, Cat in the Hat, when they heard her read it prenatally to the sound of her reading something else. Okay, so they actually will develop a preference. So in this kind of experiment, what they do is they have mom read the same book while in utero. Okay, and then we find when the infant comes out, they have a preference for that book, and they're not too interested in other ones. Okay, until they age more. Newborns also show a preference for language that their mother speaks, and this is an interesting one, because for a long time they said play classical music, those types of things. There was even some programs on it. And what we have found is those programs don't really do anything. But, and here's the but, if mom sings, if mom interacts with the infant prenatal and in the newborn years, okay, in infancy, they will have a understanding or a preference for those things that mom said, okay. And interestingly, when an infant comes out and they start crying, they've already have an accent that mimics their mother's accent. We're already born with our language accents that we use. So Spanish or German, American, Tonatham, all those different accents, we kind of become, that tends to be the way we cry and we express sound right from the beginning. Oops. Okay. So I kind of want to go through now the stages, right? So we start with crying, which is very reflexive at the beginning. And then it becomes more intentional and goal-oriented. And it indicates a need for something. It's difficult to tell why a baby is crying. However, there is growing evidence that moms can tell the difference between infant cries. So there's been some really interesting studies where you take a mother and then you take someone who's just a caregiver for the infant maybe, and the infant cries and the mother says she wants changed. And the caregiver might go, well, I think maybe hungry or maybe changed or maybe tired. But we're finding that moms tend to have this ability to identify different cries. Cooing from 2 to 4 months of age, it's not really an intelligible syllables, and it starts conversational rules. Cooing is important because what the infant is doing is learning how to use sound, even though it may not be sound that is, as it says, intelligible. They're learning how to take in a sound and then produce a sound, okay? And then around 4 to 6 months, we get into the babbling phase. This is where syllables start to, like ma, da, start to have the origins of mama, dada. And this is where usually infants start to say their first word. And the development into language and into using sounds really depends upon the parents and the caregiver's response to the infant, okay? And the vocabulary used by the parents. So many infants who dada is the first word, may represent a situation where mom is always saying dada will be home soon, dada this, dada that, versus similarly for the mama, that's more commonly heard by the infant, and they learn to then produce that sound. And then around about 6 months of age, they can start to distinguish sounds made in all languages, okay? So they're able to say this person is speaking Spanish versus English. They can't verbally say it, but they they understand it. But and this is the big but about this, is we start losing that ability around 10 months. So if we're not exposed to a given language and there's different sounds made in that language, we lose the ability to hear and distinguish that sound. And I think I mentioned this before. That's why when you hear someone speak in a foreign language, you can't hear breaks in their words. Okay. So you can hear me. So when I read, they lose most of this by 10 months, you heard the breaks between they lose most of this by 10 months. But if you've ever listened to someone in a foreign language, that sounded like one complete word. Okay. The other thing, and I think I have mentioned this in my classes, I was not exposed to, for example, Spanish in this age group, in this age, and so my wife is Mexican American, and she speaks very fluent Spanish, and there are times where she says something, and I try to produce it, and she says, no, it has this sound. And I struggle to even hear the sound. I hear her producing something, but my ability to reproduce it and understand it isn't there. So that's kind of the example of what happens when we're not exposed to many different languages. Adults teach language by talking to babies and having a back and forth exchange. And this is an important process. We have found that infants who don't have this back and forth have a very difficult time developing language. They tend to have language delays well into childhood. And the other part of this is using child-directed speech. Okay, and child-directed speech is when you don't use your adult tone, but you use, oh, you're so cute. Your pitch goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes back up again. Okay, this is important. There was a few years in the 1990s where parents were discouraged to speak baby talk or child-directed speech to their children. You should speak to them like adults, and that had disastrous consequences, because it is that high pitch to low pitch to high pitch in words that infants start to learn the breaks in the language. So when you say, you're going to lose it, you notice how I went, ooh, and then ooh, and then zzz. That allows the infant to hear that pitching to tell the difference between lose and most. So we have found that our natural way of talking with infants, and that kind of, I've heard it be called baby talk, is probably something that is pre-wired in adults to do, because it is necessary for language development. Gestures and sign language shown to facilitate nonverbal communication. And so that's another important aspect, is in communication, we both have the verbal and the nonverbal tone. You probably heard that 90% of communication is nonverbal. And so that becomes important in coordinating the language an infant hears and the action or reaction of the people around them. And then as we move along, infants can understand words starting around 9 months, despite not saying words until around 13 months. And I'm going to put this out, that there's a lot of variability in this. I don't like how they just put off the cutoffs at 9 months and 13 months. There's infants that that can talk as early as 10 months, and then there's infants or young children who may not be able to talk until 3 or 4 years of age. And the understanding of words also has that kind of variability, but maybe these are just kind of benchmarks that should be considered. By 1 year, only a few words in the vocabulary. 2 years, between 200 to 500 words have been developed, and we're starting to combine those words into meaningful, at least basic sentences. And after 2 years of age, we get that vocabulary burst that I talked about. This is where words and vocabulary are going to multiply exponentially. Okay. There are some constraints to language development. Infants tend to have a whole object bias. So, for example, a toy car isn't composed of tires and a body, no, that doesn't make sense. It's a car. And being able to identify the parts of a vehicle, such as point at the tires, becomes, or say the tires, it becomes very difficult for them. Mutual exclusivity constraints. So this is seeing that two objects can be separated in a sense, or differentiated. And then taxonomic constraints, meaning that children have a difficult time understanding some of those language things that we said earlier, such as being able to tell between the words gene, Jean, and gene, Gene. And so that's the taxonomy constraints. All right, and so this is kind of what happens starting around that 2-year mark, is children start to do what's called fast mapping. And this is a process in which children apply constraints and knowledge of grammar to learn new words very quickly. And this is that exponential explosion that we see at around 2 years of age. Syntactic bootstrapping, this is using syntax to learn new words. So for example, the Thurlum progressed the car, learning something, an object, a noun, had an action on something else. And then semantic bootstrapping, using conceptual categories to create grammatical categories. So 2 phrases start around 2 years, and then it starts to get more and more complex. So mommy up semantically means mommy pick me up. Okay. I want to make sure, okay, this is the last one. So so we got through language. We talked about how infants gain and understand knowledge. Again, I would encourage you to watch that show Inside Out, I believe is what it's called, to understand that the notion of core knowledge and core understanding. And we're born to have certain knowledge about things, to develop certain knowledge about things, okay? We talked about then language development, and how we get our human communication abilities. And so let's talk just a little bit about some risks that can risk a child's cognitive development, okay? Intellectual disabilities can come from different aspects. There's some that are due to genetic conditions, such as Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome. Things such as infections that can cause things like meningitis, which is a swelling between the skull and the brain, and it can have definite injury on the child. Malnutrition, not getting the appropriate types of nutrition that an infant needs. Teratogens are toxicities in the environment. So, clean water, all those kinds of things, clean environment. And then injuries, neglect, and abuse, we know have another huge effect on cognitive types of development. And then one thing we should note is there is a differentiation between individuals in an impoverished environment versus individuals in a non-impoverished environment. And we'll actually talk more about this when we get into the early childhood years, about and into the elementary years, how a person's environment, where they come from, has an impact on cognitive ability, including being receptive to information and producing language itself. We tend to see that people who are more raised in more impoverished area have a harder time with language development. I myself is a really good example. I was born into a very impoverished family. The famous story is that well, what my parents would do for dinner would walk down the streets, and they had walnut trees, and they would pick walnuts and eat walnuts, and that was dinner for a very long time. And I had very difficult time developing language. It unlike my peers, it probably wasn't well into my master's degree where I started being able to produce words how they're appropriately sound. And you may notice in my lectures, I may pronounce words slightly different than what the pronunciation is. And so I just bring up this example because it really has to do with the environment that I, in my case, developed language in, and we find this overall among young children. Interestingly, one of the biggest prevention programs for this in early childhood for kids in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s was Sesame Street. We found that children in poverty who watched Sesame Street didn't develop these language difficulties that other children who were not exposed to that TV show in early childhood and have. So it's kind of an interesting and some interesting studies that came out of that. But my point being is that there are interventions we can do with young children to help them develop language properly. All right, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to